My name is Cassidy, and I'm 29 years old. The Christmas I'm about to tell you about began the moment we stepped into my parents' dining room, where the pine scent from a too-dry tree mixed with gravy and burnt rolls, and I already felt that familiar tightness in my chest that always came with family gatherings, especially since my daughter had turned 10 and started noticing things adults thought kids were too young to understand, like how my dad smiled wider at my brother's kids and how my mom laughed louder when they spoke, and how my daughter, Lily, learned to fold herself small to fit into spaces she was never meant to fight for. The table was long and polished, place cards set out like rules, and before coats were even off, my dad's voice cut through the room, sharp and commanding as Lily slid into the empty chair beside me, and he said it like a verdict. "That seat is for my real grandkid. Get out!" And before I could even stand, he shoved the back of her chair, not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to humiliate. And my 10-year-old daughter hit the floor in front of the whole family while silverware rattled and nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even gasped, as if silence was safer than choosing a side. Lily's palm slapped the rug. Her eyes went wide with shock more than pain, and I remember the exact thought that burned through me. Not anger first, but clarity, because in that second I saw every holiday before it, every birthday where her gift was smaller, every photo where she was placed at the edge, every time my dad corrected someone who called her his granddaughter, saying, "She's not blood," and my mom would sip her wine and pretend not to hear. I helped Lily up, brushed her knees, and she looked at me with that brave, confused smile kids use when they don't want to cry in public. And the room stayed frozen, the tree lights blinking like nothing was wrong, my brother staring at his phone, my aunt studying her plate, my mom gripping her wine glass too tightly. My dad straightened his sweater like he'd just fixed a crooked napkin and muttered something about tradition, about how real grandkids sit closest to him, as if the word real could erase a child standing right there. I didn't yell, I didn't scream, I didn't curse, because my voice felt steady in a way that scared even me. And I said 4 words quietly, clearly, enough for everyone to hear, words that cut through the room sharper than any shout. And when I said them, my mom dropped her wine glass, red splashing across the rug like a wound, and my dad went pale, the color draining from his face as if he'd suddenly realized this wasn't a moment he could bully his way through. Lily clutched my hand, and I felt the tremor in her fingers. The way a kid's body remembers things long after adults pretend they didn't happen. And I told her we were leaving, not asking, telling, because some lessons don't need discussion. As we walked out, coats still hanging, food untouched, I heard my dad sputter behind us about respect and family. And I thought about how respect was always demanded downward in that house, never earned upward. In the car, Lily asked in a small voice if she'd done something wrong, and that nearly broke me, because no child should have to ask that, after being shoved off a chair by an adult who's supposed to love them. I told her the truth, that she did nothing wrong, that sometimes grown-ups are wrong and loud about it, and that none of this was her fault. That night, after she fell asleep with Christmas lights reflecting on her wall, I sat at my kitchen table replaying the scene. The words, the shove, the silence, and I realized the shove wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that everyone had stayed silent, because silence teaches a child exactly how much they're worth in a room. I thought about all the times I'd swallowed comments to keep the peace, how I'd told myself it was easier to endure than to fight, and how that choice had just put my daughter on the floor. By morning, I knew something had shifted permanently, because when I looked at my phone and saw my dad's missed calls, I didn't feel dread, I felt resolve, the kind that comes when you stop hoping people will change and start deciding what you will tolerate. And I knew that what happened at that Christmas table was only the beginning of a story my father had no idea he'd started. The morning after Christmas, I made a decision that surprised even me. Not because it was sudden, but because it felt overdue, like finally exhaling after holding my breath for years. And while my dad kept leaving voicemails about how I'd embarrassed him in front of the family and how Lily needed to learn her place, I was sitting across from a lawyer with a calm I didn't recognize, explaining how my father had never legally adopted Lily as his grandchild, how my late grandmother had left a trust specifically worded for all grandchildren raised as family, and how my dad had quietly been managing it since she passed, deciding on his own who counted as real. The lawyer listened without interrupting, then asked one question that changed everything. Had Lily been living with me full-time since she was a toddler, supported emotionally and financially as my child, presented publicly as his grandchild, and when I said yes, he nodded slowly and said my father didn't get to redefine family just because it suited him. And that shove at the Christmas table wasn't just cruel, it was evidence. A week later, while my dad was probably still telling relatives how dramatic I was, a lawyer knocked on his door, not with holiday cheer but with papers. And inside those papers were words my father had never expected to read. Words about fiduciary duty, about misuse of authority, about how excluding one child while benefiting others could unravel everything he thought he controlled. When he called me this time, his voice wasn't angry. It was thin, asking what I'd done, and I told him exactly what he'd done first, reminding him of his own words. That seat is for my real grandkid. Get out! And how those words didn't just echo in a dining room, they echoed in legal language too, because intent matters, patterns matter, and the truth has a way of finding doors to knock on. My mom showed up at my place days later, eyes red, saying she never meant for things to go that far, and I told her that far was a 10-year-old on the floor, while adults stared at their plates. That far was years of silence, and that dropping a wine glass after the fact didn't clean the stain. Lily overheard part of that conversation. And later she asked if Grandpa was in trouble, and I told her no one was in trouble for telling the truth. But sometimes people face consequences for ignoring it, and she nodded like she understood more than she should have had to. The fallout was messy because accountability always is. Family group chats went quiet, then loud, then quiet again, and stories shifted as people tried to rewrite what they'd seen with their own eyes. But the facts didn't move, and neither did the lawyer. When the trust was reviewed, it turned out my grandmother had anticipated exactly this kind of gatekeeping, leaving clauses my dad had skimmed over because he never thought anyone would challenge him. Clauses that recognized Lily fully, explicitly, as family. No asterisks, no blood tests, no approval required. The day it was finalized, I didn't feel triumphant, I felt relieved. Because the win wasn't money or validation. It was knowing that my daughter would never again be told she wasn't real enough to sit at a table. My dad avoided me after that. The man who once filled every room now shrinking from accountability, and when we did cross paths months later, he wouldn't meet Lily's eyes, which told me everything I needed to know. The family learned a new script too, one where silence had a cost, where watching something wrong happen and doing nothing no longer felt safe. And I won't pretend that fixed everything, but it changed the balance. Sometimes Lily still asks why some grandparents act like that, and I tell her the truth in words a child can carry. That some people confuse control with love, and when they lose control, they show who they really are. If there's one thing I learned from that Christmas, it's that protecting your child doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like 4 quiet words, a steady voice, and the courage to let a lawyer knock on a door that's been closed for too long. Because when someone says, that seat is for my real grandkid, get out! And pushes a child to the floor while everyone stays silent, the most powerful response isn't yelling back, it's making sure that silence never protects them again. If this story moved you, if you believe kids deserve dignity and family means showing up when it's uncomfortable, then subscribe to the channel. Because stories like this deserve to be heard, remembered, and never repeated.